Get out of my OR. Dr. Jonathan Fields didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for every nurse, every tech, every terrified resident in that trauma bay to hear. He pointed at Mia Rodriguez like she was furniture that had wandered into the wrong room. You are a floor nurse. You hand me instruments. You do not suggest procedure to me. Do you understand what you are? Mia didn't flinch. She held the chart. Her hands were steady, and somewhere beneath the starched scrubs and the silence she'd worn like armor for 3 years, something old and dangerous stirred. She looked at the man bleeding out on that table. She looked at Fields, and she said quietly, "Then let me be just a nurse, and let me save his life." If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and it changed everything. Mia Rodriguez was charting at the nurse's station on the 4th floor when the radio crackled and the words cut through the usual hospital hum like a blade. Trauma incoming, military, blast injury, it takes 6 minutes. She was already moving before the charge nurse finished repeating it. She wasn't supposed to go down to trauma. 4th floor was her assignment. Orthopedic recovery, post-surgical monitoring, the quiet work of keeping people stable through the long hours after their crisis had already passed. That was her world at St. Catherine's Hospital in Chicago. That was the world she had carefully, deliberately built for herself over the last 3 years. But her feet carried her to the elevator anyway. She told herself it was protocol. All available clinical staff were sometimes pulled to trauma during mass casualty events. She told herself it was professional instinct. Neither of those things was entirely true. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. She heard blast injury and something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. The trauma bay was already controlled chaos by the time she arrived. Residents were pulling on gloves. A respiratory tech was checking the ventilator setup. 2 nurses she recognized from the ER night shift were laying out instrument trays with the focused speed of people who had done this 1,000 times. And at the center of it all, Dr. Jonathan Fields stood with his arms crossed, watching the doors, his jaw set like he was daring the night to throw something at him he couldn't handle. Fields was 46 years old, chief of trauma surgery at St. Catherine's, and the most technically gifted surgeon Mia had ever watched work. He was also, without question, the most arrogant human being she had encountered since leaving the military, and that was a category that included several actual generals. He noticed her the moment she walked in. His eyes moved over her with the same brief dismissive sweep he used on medical students who showed up without being called. "Rodriguez," he said, "what are you doing in my trauma bay?" "I heard the call," she said. "Blast injury. I have experience with blast trauma." "You have experience with post-surgical care on the 4th floor," he said. "That's what you're paid for. Go back upstairs." She didn't move. "I'd like to stay, Dr. Fields." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds longer than he needed to, which was his way of making the point without having to repeat himself. Then he turned back to the doors and ignored her completely. She stayed. She moved to the edge of the room and pulled on a pair of gloves, and she waited. The doors burst open at 11:53. Sergeant Michael Carter was 31 years old, 6'2", and built like a man who had spent a decade doing things that required that kind of body. None of that meant anything right now. Right now, he was gray-faced and barely conscious, strapped to a gurney with 2 field medics working either side of him, and a level of controlled urgency in their voices that Mia recognized immediately. That particular tone, that we did everything we could and it wasn't enough tone. She had used it herself more times than she could count in places that looked nothing like this clean, bright room. GSW to the left shoulder, shrapnel throughout the thoracic cavity, possible internal bleed. BP's been dropping for 20 minutes. We've pushed 2 liters of saline. The field medic rattled off as they transferred him to the table. He was coherent on scene, kept asking about his guys. Lost consciousness about 4 minutes out. Fields moved in fast, stethoscope out, hands already working. "Get me imaging. Full chest, abdomen. Let's go." Mia watched. She watched the monitors. She watched Carter's color. She watched the way his chest rose and fell, with a slight hitch on the left side that the machines weren't picking up yet because the machines were only as good as what you told them to look for. She had seen that hitch before. In a forward operating base outside of Kandahar, in a tent that smelled like diesel and blood, she had seen that exact pattern in a corporal named Dennis, who'd taken a fragment from an IED and been written off before she'd gotten her hands on him. Dennis had survived. She stepped forward. "Dr. Fields." He didn't look up. "Not now." "The hitch in his breathing," she said, "at left side. It's not just the shrapnel. I think he has a hemothorax developing. If we wait for imaging." "I said not now, Rodriguez." He said it the way you said it to someone who had just knocked over a glass at a dinner party. Mildly irritated, not worth real anger. "Let me work." She stepped back. She watched the monitors. She counted seconds. The imaging came back 8 minutes later, and Fields studied it with the focused quiet of a man reading a language he'd spent 20 years learning. She watched his expression. She watched the exact moment he saw it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional pause. "Hemothorax," he said. "Left side. Significant accumulation. We need a chest tube now." One of the residents started moving. Mia moved faster. She had the setup at the bedside before the resident was halfway across the room, and Fields glanced at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise. It was the look of a man who had decided he would accept the help without acknowledging where it came from. "Hold this," he told her, meaning the retractor. She held it. She stood across the table from him, and she did exactly what he told her, nothing more, and she watched the blood pressure slowly begin to climb back towards something survivable. Carter's hand moved, his fingers curled against the sheet. He wasn't conscious, not fully, but something in him was fighting, and she could feel it in the room like a current. "He's stabilizing," one of the residents said with the audible relief of someone who'd been holding their breath. Fields stepped back from the table and pulled off his gloves and looked at the numbers on the monitor with the expression of a man reviewing a test he'd expected to pass. "Good. Get him up to surgical ICU. I want continuous monitoring, and I want the shrapnel mapped before we go back in tomorrow." He glanced at Mia as if noticing her for the first time since the procedure. "You can go back upstairs now." She pulled off her gloves. "Of course," she said. She walked out of the trauma bay, and she stood in the hallway and she breathed. She was not angry. She recognized it as something she'd learned a long time ago. You cannot afford anger when someone needs you to be precise. You can be angry later in the car in the shower at 3 in the morning when the adrenaline finally drains away and you're left with nothing but the memory of what happened and the full weight of how it felt. But not in the room, never in the room. She went back upstairs and she finished her charts, and she did not think about Michael Carter again until the following morning when she came in for her shift and found him awake. He had been moved out of surgical ICU faster than expected. His vitals had stabilized overnight. The chest tube was doing its job, and whatever military-grade constitution he'd built over a decade of service was apparently still functioning even after the night he'd had. He was in room 412, one of her rooms, which was either a coincidence or the universe having a very specific sense of humor. She knocked on the open door, and he turned his head toward her, and she got her first real look at him, conscious. He had brown eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be given what he'd been through. He was still pale, still hooked to more machines than she'd like for a man his age, but the color was coming back, and his jaw was set with the particular stubbornness of someone who did not intend to be in a hospital bed a moment longer than necessary. "Morning," she said, moving to the monitor to check his numbers. "I'm Mia Rodriguez. I'll be taking care of you this shift." "They told me you were in the trauma bay last night," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, but steadier than she expected. "One of the medics who came in with me, he said there was a nurse who—" He stopped, watched her check the readout. "He said you were the one who called it, the hemothorax." She didn't look up from the monitor. "Dr. Fields called it. I just assisted." A pause. "That's not what he said." She looked at him then. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from a different life. The way soldiers looked at each other when they were trying to decide if someone was the real thing or just wearing the right clothes. Assessing. Measuring. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got blown up," he said, which is what happened, and so. He shifted against the pillow and didn't quite suppress the wince. "Where are we? What hospital?" "St. Catherine's, Chicago." "Chicago?" He said it like he was placing himself on a map. "I'm from Michigan originally, Rockford, you know it." "I know where it is." "Long way from Afghanistan?" He said it conversationally, watching her face. She finished checking the chart and made a note and did not react to the word Afghanistan. I need to check your dressing, she said. This might be uncomfortable. I've had worse. He said it flatly, not as a boast, just as a fact. He let her work, and he was quiet for a moment, and then, how long you been a nurse? 3 years here. Before that, I had other work. What kind of other work? She secured the dressing and straightened up. The kind that taught me what a hemothorax sounds like before the imaging confirms it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like a door opening, a crack. Yeah, he said, I figured. She picked up his chart. Your numbers look good. The chest tube is draining well. Dr. Fields will be in to see you this afternoon and we'll discuss the timeline for the shrapnel removal. She moved toward the door. Mia, he said. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for last night, whatever they want to call it. She held his chart against her chest and she looked at him. This man who had nearly died on her table in a trauma bay where no one had wanted her. And she said, just doing my job, Sergeant. She went out into the hall and she kept walking. The day moved the way hospital days do, in layers of urgency and tedium, moments of high focus bracketed by the administrative grind of documentation and supply checks, and the 100 small negotiations that made up the life of a nurse on a busy floor. Mia moved through all of it with the economy of someone who had learned very early that wasted motion cost lives. She was quick, she was thorough, she was the nurse other nurses came to when they weren't sure about something. She had been that way since her first week at St. Catherine's, and it had earned her exactly the kind of quiet, professional respect that never translated into being invited to lunch or remembered by name when the chief of surgery was doing rounds. She was used to it. She had made her choices. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Fields came to do rounds on Carter, and Mia happened to be at the nurse's station when he came off the elevator. He was flanked by 2 residents talking without looking at them the way he always did. She watched him without appearing to, which was a skill she had honed over years that had nothing to do with nursing. He stopped at the station and flipped through the chart without acknowledging her. His drainage numbers look good, she said. I can read Rodriguez. Of course. She went back to her documentation. He paused. She felt the pause rather than saw it, a slight change in the ambient energy, the way you feel a shift in wind before you hear it. Then the hemothorax presentation. Last night. Walk me through your reasoning. She looked up. Both residents were studiously examining their tablets. Martin, sure. You flagged it before imaging confirmed it, he said. I want to know your clinical reasoning. He said it the way he asked residents to present, clipped and evaluative, and with the built-in implication that the wrong answer was going to be instructive for everyone present. She set down her pen. The breathing pattern, left laterally hitch subtle, inconsistent with pure shrapnel obstruction. Combined with the BP trajectory and the mechanism of injury, blast trauma at close range tends to create a pressure wave that... Mechanism of injury, he repeated. You said blast trauma at close range. How do you know it was close range? A half-second pause, shorter than a heartbeat. The medic's report noted the blast radius. He watched her. She held his gaze without expression. The medic's report said explosion during a military operation, he said. It didn't specify range. That was your inference. The residents had stopped pretending to look at their tablets. Yes, she said, it was an inference based on the injury pattern. Based on what frame of reference? She picked up her pen again. Medical literature, she said. If there's nothing else, Dr. Fields, I have charts to finish. He studied her for one more moment, and then he walked toward room 412 with his residents behind him, and Mia went back to her documentation and did not let her hands shake. She was very good at not letting her hands shake. When Fields came out of Carter's room 20 minutes later, he was alone. The residents had apparently been dispatched elsewhere. He stopped in the hallway outside the door, and he stood there for a moment in the particular stillness of a man revising something he thought he already understood. Mia was 3 rooms down checking on a post-op hip replacement, and she didn't look at him, but she was aware of exactly where he was, the way she was aware of all the moving pieces in any given space. That too was not something she'd learned in nursing school. He walked back to the station. He set Carter's chart on the counter between them. He's asking about you, Fields said. She looked up. Sergeant Carter. He wanted to know who the nurse was who called the hemothorax. I told him it was a team effort. A pause loaded and precise. He didn't believe me. Apparently one of his medics was talking to ER staff this morning. I don't control what people say. No, Fields agreed. You don't. He picked up the chart again. He turned it over in his hands once without looking at it. Rodriguez, how long did you say you've been a nurse? 3 years. Before that, I had other work. You said that already. He set the chart down. The injury pattern read you called. The inference about blast range. The way you set up that chest tube kit before I'd finished reviewing imaging. He paused. Those aren't things you learn from medical literature. The hallway was quiet between them. Somewhere down at the end of the floor, a monitor beeped twice and went silent. Dr. Fields, she said, is there a clinical question I can help you with? He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the chart and tucked it under his arm and walked to the elevator without answering. She turned back to her computer and she typed the words she needed to type, and she breathed through the place in her chest where the past kept trying to claw its way back to the surface. At 4 o'clock, she went to check Carter's vitals, and she found him awake and sitting up slightly more than his discharge protocol technically allowed. He had managed to get his phone from somewhere, probably a personal effects bag she hadn't noticed, and he was frowning at it with the look of a man whose inbox had become a problem he couldn't solve lying down. You should be reclining, she said. I've been reclining for 16 hours. You've been in surgery and then unconscious for 16 hours. That's different. She adjusted his bed angle with the mechanical control, bringing it up to the medically sanctioned 45 degrees. Better? No. He put the phone down and looked at her. Fields was in here. I know. He's trying to figure you out. She checked the drain output. Most people aren't that interested. He is. He's the kind of man who needs to know how things work. He watched her work with that same measuring quality from the morning. I'm kind of like that too, actually. A lot of that in the military, she said without inflecting it. He was quiet for a beat. Then you were enlisted. She didn't answer. Not a question, he said. The way you move in a medical space, the way you tracked the whole room last night, I could tell from the way the medic described it. You weren't just watching the patient. You were watching the team, watching the equipment, watching the exits. That's not a hospital habit. That's a trained habit. She put his chart back in the holder. Your color is better, she said. That's a good sign. Mia, she stopped moving. I've been around enough people who are hiding something to know what it looks like, he said. Not unkindly, just factually the way he'd said I've had worse. I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I don't have that right. But I want you to know, he paused and something shifted in his voice, something that had been held carefully in place and was now just slightly letting go. Whatever you did last night, whatever you are, you saved my life, and I don't forget that. She stood at the foot of his bed and she looked at this man who had been dying 12 hours ago, and she thought about all the things she had not said to anyone in 3 years. The weight of them sat in her chest like old shrapnel that had never quite been removed. Get some rest, Sergeant, she said. She walked out. In the supply room at the end of the hall, she stood for 60 seconds with her back against the shelving and her eyes closed, and she breathed until her hands were steady again. Then she went back to work. The evening shift change brought a fresh wave of staff and the particular quiet that settled over hospital floors after visiting hours ended. Mia finished her notes at the station and was pulling on her jacket when she heard it. A voice from room 412, not distressed, not the flat emergency monotone of a monitor alarm. Something quieter and worse. She pushed the door open. Carter was awake. He'd managed to pull himself upright, and he was holding his phone to his ear with the expression of a man receiving news that was reorganizing everything inside him. His jaw was set hard. His eyes were dry, but they were the kind of dry that cost something to maintain. He looked up and saw her, and he said into the phone quietly, "I'll call you back." And then he put it down in his lap and he stared at the wall for a moment before he spoke. One of my guys didn't make it, he said. Private First Class Danny Reyes, 22 years old, from El Paso. He said it like he was reading it off something. Like if he said the facts exactly right, he could make them stay in the correct order. He was the youngest in the unit. He stopped, pressed his lips together. He used to save his MRE crackers and give them to the stray dogs outside the base. Mia did not say I'm sorry. She had learned a long time ago that I'm sorry was what you said when you didn't know what else to do. She walked to the chair beside his bed and she sat down in it, which was not standard nursing protocol, and which she knew she would do anyway, and she said nothing at all. He looked at her sitting there, and some of the rigid set of his shoulders changed. "You've gotten this call," he said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the phone in his lap. "The worst part is, you can't do anything. You go through everything you did, everything you could have done differently, and at the end of it," he exhaled. "At the end of it, it's still happening. And the next morning, somebody else needs you to be functional, and you just have to." He shook his head. "Be functional," she said quietly. "Yeah." He looked at her. "How do you do it, the carrying it?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the floor hummed along. Somewhere a cart wheeled past. The monitor beside his bed kept its steady, indifferent count of his heartbeats. "You put it somewhere," she said. "Not away, you can't put it away, but you find a place in you that can hold it while your hands are busy, and you keep your hands busy." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between recognition and something else, something more careful. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. "Keeping your hands busy?" She looked at him for a long moment. The question sat between them and did not dissipate. "It's getting late," she said. "You need sleep, and so do I." She stood up. She moved toward the door. "Mia," he said, for the second time. The way he said her name had a quality that she was not going to examine right now. Not tonight, not with everything else she was carrying. "Thank you for sitting here." She nodded once without turning around, and she walked out, and she took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed the 3 floors worth of ordinary effort to put the walls back where they belonged. It was not until she was in her car in the parking garage, hands on the wheel, that she let herself sit with the full weight of the day. Carter's face, Fields' questions, the word Afghanistan hanging in the air of a hospital room like smoke that hadn't cleared. The life she had built here, this careful, quiet, controlled life, the life that was supposed to be simple, was developing cracks she hadn't accounted for. She had been very good for 3 years at being just a nurse. She started the car. She pulled out of the garage into the Chicago night. She did not know yet how little time she had left before all of it came apart. Part 2. Louis viết đưa ba ngàn từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần tiếp đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI kể theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mục document mới. 2 đến 3 phút, cần có mini climax và đạt 10 đến 15. Mini climax mỗi phần cừ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả, thêm đánh dấu thời gian. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, không có phần gạch. Trong bài viết văn bản phù hợp với thesis và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé, không chia móc thời gian. Show more 1439 orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with escalating tension and psychological depth. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with escalating tension and psychological depth. She slept 4 hours. She knew it was 4 hours because she watched the clock from 2 until 6, and for the 2 hours in between, she was somewhere that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, the place where the memories lived that she had never been able to fully discipline. Kandahar, the dust that got into everything, the particular sound of a medevac cutting through a night that smelled like cordite and heat. Dennis on that cot, his lips going gray, her hands working. Someone behind her saying it's too late and her not stopping anyway. She got up at 6 and made coffee she didn't taste and drove to St. Catharines in the dark of an early Chicago morning with the radio off and the window cracked just enough to feel the cold. And she thought about Michael Carter saying, "How do you do it, the carrying it?" She didn't have a better answer in the daylight than she'd had the night before. The floor was in the middle of shift change when she arrived at that 20-minute window of controlled overlap where 2 sets of nurses passed the night's information back and forth like a baton in a relay that never fully stopped. Mia took her report and moved through it with the focused efficiency that had become her signature on the floor. She already knew Carter's overnight numbers before Deb Garcia finished reading them off to her because she had checked the electronic chart from her phone in the parking garage. BP holding steady. Drain output slightly reduced, which was good. Pain management was proving complicated because he kept refusing the higher dosage options and asking for the minimum, which was either admirable or stubborn, depending on how you looked at it. She thought it was probably both. She went to check on him before she did anything else, and she found him not asleep, not resting, not doing any of the things a man with a chest tube and recent surgery was supposed to be doing at 6:15 in the morning. He was on the floor beside his bed doing one-arm push-ups. "Sergeant Carter." He looked up. He didn't stop immediately. He did two more controlled and deliberate, then shifted his weight and stood with only the mildest evidence of the effort it had cost him. "Morning." That is not what the discharge protocol says. The discharge protocol doesn't know me very well yet. She crossed her arms. "You have a chest tube. Do you understand what could happen if you—" "I know what a chest tube is," he said, and there was no sharpness in it, just the quiet certainty of a man who had been injured before and knew the vocabulary. "I've had two, different circumstances." He moved back toward the bed and sat on the edge of it. "I need to move. If I stay still too long, I start thinking, and right now thinking is not helping me." She looked at him for a moment. She understood that completely, and she was not going to say so. "There are supervised physical therapy protocols I can request," she said. "Until then, you stay in the bed or the chair. Agreed?" He looked at her. "You're not going to yell at me. Would it help?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to matter. "Probably not." "Then no." She moved to check his drain. "Back on the bed." He shifted back. She worked in silence for a moment, and she was aware of him watching her with that particular attentiveness. He had the kind that wasn't intrusive but wasn't absent either, the kind that noticed things. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I said." She glanced up. He was watching her without apology, the way people did when they decided to be direct because they'd learned somewhere that indirect was a waste of everyone's time. She recognized that too. "I slept fine," she said. "Okay," he said in the tone of someone who did not believe that and had decided not to push it. "Yet. Fields came back last night. Late. I didn't expect that." Her hand stilled on the drain line, just for a fraction of a second. "What did he want?" "He said he was checking on the drainage output," which it was maybe technically true. Carter paused, but he stood in the doorway for about 30 seconds before he came in, and he kept looking at my chart the way someone looks at something when they're not really reading it. She finished checking the drain and made her note and kept her voice clinical. "His post-surgical follow-up schedule is his business. He asked me about you." She looked up now. "He wanted to know what we talked about. Whether you'd said anything about your background." Carter's voice was even and informational, no editorial added, just laying the facts down. "I told him we'd discussed my pain management and my vitals, which was true. You didn't have to cover for me." "I didn't cover for you," he said. "I answered the question I was asked. He asked what you'd said. He didn't ask whether you'd sat in that chair for 45 minutes while I tried to hold it together after finding out about Danny." A pause. That part wasn't his business. Something moved through her chest that she didn't have a name for right away. Warmth and caution mixed together, which was the most dangerous combination she knew. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It wasn't strategic. He stopped. He picked up his water cup from the tray and looked at it instead of at her. "I don't talk about Danny with people I don't trust. And last night you were there, and that meant something." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about him. About Reyes." "Yeah." He set the cup down. "Me too." She picked up his chart. "Physical therapy consult this afternoon. Until then, you stay off the floor. I'm not negotiating on the push-ups." "Roger that," he said, and there was something in how he said it, the easy military shorthand that sounded like something relaxing that had been held tight. She was at the door when he said, "Mia, how long were you in?" She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. The question sat in the air between them, not aggressive, not trying to expose anything, just honest. The kind of honest that deserved honest back. 8 years, she said. She did not turn around. She heard him exhale, quiet and understanding. She walked back to the station and she started her morning rounds, and she did not let herself think about what she'd just said or why she'd said it or the fact that it was the first time in 3 years she had answered that question with anything other than silence. Fields found her at 11. She was in the medication room running a count when he appeared in the doorway, and something in his posture told her this was not going to be a question about a patient's chart. He came in and he let the door close behind him, and he stood with his hands in the pockets of his white coat, in the way he stood when he was thinking out loud and trying to make it look like he already knew the answer. "I requested your personnel file from HR this morning," he said. She continued her count. "That's your right as department chief. They sent me your hiring documentation 3 years ago, references from a surgical floor in Cincinnati, nursing degree from University of Illinois, Chicago." He paused. "No prior employment listed. Prior to my nursing degree, I was not in healthcare. Prior to your nursing degree, you were in the Army." She put down the medication tray. She turned around. She looked at him with the full steadiness she possessed, which was considerable, and she said, "How did you?" One of the ER nurses recognized the name. "She had a brother at Fort Campbell, same time you would have been." He paused. "Captain Mia Rodriguez, 88th Medical Brigade, 2 deployments, Afghanistan, 1 Iraq, Silver Star." He let that last part sit in the air between them for a moment. "You want to tell me why you walked into my hospital as a floor nurse with a Silver Star in a box somewhere and let me treat you like a second-year resident for 3 years? The medication room was very small and very quiet. I wanted a quiet life," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." He looked at her. She looked at him. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one from the hallway the day before. That one had been dismissive. This one was something else, something closer to reckoning. "I owe you an apology," he said, and it sounded like it cost him something. A man like Fields didn't build a career on apologies. Not just for yesterday, for 3 years of... He stopped, pressed his lips together. "You're the best clinical instinct on this floor, and I have been looking straight through you since you got here." She crossed her arms. "I'm aware. That's not a response designed to make me feel better." "No," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "The technique you used last night, in the trauma bay before we confirmed imaging, the way you'd already anticipated the chest tube setup, that's battlefield medicine. It's practical medicine," she said. "The setting doesn't change the physiology." "No, but it changes how fast you have to think." He picked up the medication tray she'd set down, and he turned it over in his hands the way he'd turned the chart over the day before. "We have a case tomorrow morning. Polytrauma. The initial imaging shows a pattern I don't love. I'd like you in the OR." She stared at him. "You'd like a floor nurse in your OR. I'd like a combat-trained trauma specialist in my OR. The floor nurse part is a title that is apparently about 15 pay grades below where you should be." He set the tray down. "I'm going to look into what it would take to change that." She thought about saying no. She thought about the careful walls she'd spent 3 years constructing, the deliberate smallnesses of the life she'd chosen, the reasons she'd had for choosing it, that still lived in her chest like old bruises that never quite healed. She thought about Michael Carter on that table with his blood pressure dropping and nobody in that room seeing what she saw. "What time is the case?" she said. 7:30. "I'll be there." He nodded once and walked out, and she stood in the medication room for a moment, with something happening in her chest that she could not immediately categorize. It was not triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was closer to the feeling she'd had the first time she'd put on a uniform, which was terror and rightness mixed together in proportions that didn't quite add up to anything comfortable. She went back to her rounds. Carter was in physical therapy at 2, which she had arranged with the department, and which he had gone to with the focused compliance of a man who had decided cooperation was faster than resistance. She got a report from the PT at 3:30 that said he'd pushed the protocol about as far as they'd let him, which surprised no one. She was at the station finishing afternoon, charting when the elevator opened, and a woman walked out who changed the temperature of the floor, the way a cold front changes the temperature of a room. She was in her early 40s wearing civilian clothes that still somehow looked like a uniform. The posture and the bearing and the way she held her chin up, not quite enough to be arrogant, but enough to be a statement. Her hair was dark and cut short, and her eyes moved across the floor, The way trained eyes move, cataloging, assessing not with hostility, but with the automatic professional habit of someone who always knew the layout of every room they walked into. Mia knew her before she was close enough to speak. She knew her the way you know someone you have tried very hard to forget and your body hasn't cooperated. Lieutenant Colonel Dana Voss, former commanding officer, currently based on the last thing Mia had heard 3 years ago serving with the Army Medical Command out of Fort Sam Houston. Dana walked to the nurses' station and looked at Mia without surprise, which meant she had already known Mia would be here, which meant this was not an accident. "Mia," she said. "Colonel Voss." "I'm retired," Dana said. "Just Dana." She smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind Mia had always trusted, which made it the most complicated thing in the room. "You look good. You look like you have a reason for being here that has nothing to do with being a patient." Dana's smile didn't change. "Can we talk somewhere?" Mia looked at her for a long moment. She thought about Michael Carter in room 412 and the way he'd said 8 years like he was understanding a complicated equation, and she thought about Fields asking, "How did you know the range of the blast?" And she thought about the particular feeling of a life you built carefully beginning to crumble at its edges. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She finished the note she was writing. She logged out of the computer. She was very deliberate about both of those things because deliberateness was how she kept herself from running in either direction toward the thing or away from it. They went to the family consultation room at the end of the hall. Dana sat across from her and folded her hands on the table with the kind of composed attention that Mia remembered from briefings from the small tent outside Kandahar, where Dana would sit exactly like this before telling you something that was going to change your deployment, your orders, your understanding of what you'd signed up for. "How did you find me?" Mia said. Well, it wasn't a question. "Sergeant Carter's medevac report," Dana said. His unit filed the incident report and the treating facility was listed. "When I saw your name on the triage documentation, She paused. "I've always known where you were, Mia. I just respected the choice you made to be left alone." "Then why are you here now?" Dana uncrossed her hands. She leaned forward slightly and something changed in her expression, the official composure dropping a layer to reveal something more personal underneath. "Because Michael Carter being in that bed is not a coincidence. And because the unit he was with when the blast happened was running an op that I'm involved in at a level I can't discuss in a hallway or a chart or a phone call." She looked at Mia steadily. "And because whatever you did in that trauma bay last night is going to have consequences you aren't prepared for. People are paying attention, Mia. People who weren't supposed to know you were here." The consultation room was very quiet. The fluorescent light above them hummed with a frequency that Mia had never consciously noticed before. "What kind of people?" she said. Dana met her eyes. "The kind that knew Captain Rodriguez before she became a floor nurse in Chicago. The kind that have been very interested in where she went." Mia's hands were flat on the table. She kept them there deliberately. She breathed through the thing that was rising in her chest, which was not fear. Not exactly, but was the thing that lived next to fear when you'd spent enough years being the person that other people came to when the situation had already gotten bad. "You need to tell me everything," Mia said. Dana opened her mouth to answer, and the PA system cut through the building with 3 short tones that every person in that hospital knew and feared. "Code Blue, room 412, Carter." Mia was out of the chair before the 3rd tone finished. "Part 3, Louis Viet Du Bang and Tu, Liên Kết Liên Mật, với các phần trục trong câu chuyện phá hủy thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mật khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mật với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đấu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống dần dào cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần tiếp đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI kể theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ kịch tính. Không viết lần man kết thúc phần, không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mục document mới. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đất 10 đến 15 mini climax mỗi. Phần cử 10 đến 12 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc đang xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả, thêm đánh dấu thời gian. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, không có phần gạch trong bài viết. Viết văn bản phù hợp với TTS và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Không chia mốc thời gian. Số 40-42. Orchestrated dramatic narrative, continuation with dialogue-driven tension, and strategic pacing. Orchestrated dramatic narrative, continuation with dialogue-driven tension, and strategic pacing. She hit the door of room 412 at a full run, and what she found stopped her for exactly 1 second before her training took over and erased every personal feeling she had brought with her down the hall. Carter was on the floor beside the bed. He had pulled the chest tube line taut when he went down, and the monitor had registered the disruption and screamed. He was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, his eyes open and tracking her as she dropped to her knees beside him, but his color was wrong and his breathing was the shallow, tight kind that meant something was happening in his chest that should not be happening. Talk to me, she said. Her hands were already on him. I stood up, he said through his teeth. Too fast. Everything went sideways. Does it hurt to breathe? Everything hurts to breathe. More than before. He thought about that for a half second, which told her he was still cognitively intact and actually assessing rather than just reacting. Yeah, more than before. Left side. The chest tube. She looked at the line and she saw it immediately. The connection at the drainage system had partially disconnected when he'd fallen and the seal was compromised. A nurse's aide had come in behind her and was frozen near the door, with the look of someone who needed to be given a job before they became another problem. Get me a chest tube kit from the supply cart and get Dr. Fields on the phone right now, Mia said without looking up. Go. The aide went. Dana appeared in the doorway and Mia registered her presence the way she registered all the variables in a medical space, neutrally filed, not reacted to yet. Can you move your legs? She asked Carter. Yes. Any head pain? Did you hit your head when you went down? No, I caught myself. He had one hand braced on the floor, and she could see the effort it was costing him to stay calm, the controlled breathing that was both instinctive discipline and a response to genuine pain. This is the tube, isn't it? The connection came loose, she said. I need you to stay very still. Staying still, he said, and there was a grimness in it that she recognized as the particular brand of military humor that existed because the alternative was panic, and panic was not an option. The aide came back with the kit. Mia had her gloves on before the cart stopped moving, and she was working before anyone in the room had drawn a breath, reestablishing the seal with the focused precision of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a clean hospital floor in a tent with one flashlight and the sound of incoming artillery in the background and her own heartbeat counting the seconds she had. Mia? Dana's voice from the doorway, level and quiet. Not right now, Mia said. His monitor. I see it. She did. The saturation was dropping slower than a free fall, but not slow enough. Her hands moved. She talked to Carter while she worked because silence was what fear grew in, and fear was the one thing neither of them could afford. Stay with me. Tell me about Danny Reyes. Where was he from again? Carter's jaw tightened. El Paso, I told you. Tell me again. El Paso. His mom made tamales every Christmas, and he talked about them like they were a religious experience. The words were coming out tight, effortful, but they were coming. He wanted to open a restaurant when he got out. He had a whole business plan. He'd been working on it for 2 years. What was he going to call it? Danny's. A pause, the kind that hurt. Not very original, but he said, why complicate it? The seal held. She checked it twice. She watched the monitor numbers. The saturation stopped dropping. It held at 91 for 6 seconds that felt like a full minute, and then it began slowly to climb. Good, she said under her breath, not to him, to the numbers, to the situation. Okay. Fields came through the door 40 seconds later at a speed she had never seen him move before, which told her that whoever had called him had used the right words. He took in the scene in one sweep, Carter on the floor with Mia kneeling beside him and the drainage system resealed, and he crouched down and looked at the work she'd done, and something moved across his face that he did not entirely manage to neutralize. What happened? He said. He stood too fast. Lost consciousness, briefly went down. The tube connection came loose. She was already gathering the used materials as she spoke. Seal is reestablished. SAT is coming back up 93 now. He needs imaging to confirm no additional complications, and I'd like him on continuous monitoring through the night. Fields looked at Carter. You want to tell me what part of stay in the bed didn't translate? I was trying to reach the water, Carter said with the expression of a man who was aware this was not his best moment. The water that is right here, Fields said, placing the cup directly in Carter's line of sight with the measured deliberateness of someone who has practiced professional patience for a long time. On the tray, that is designed to be within reach, without standing. I see it now. Wonderful. He looked back at Mia. Help me get him up. Between the two of them and Dana, who moved into the room without being asked and positioned herself at Carter's left side with a competence that Fields clocked and filed away, they got him back into the bed with minimal additional stress to the tube line. Carter was quiet through the process, not sullen quiet, but the concentrated quiet of a man managing pain and keeping his face in order while he did it. When he was settled and Fields had done a preliminary assessment and confirmed the seal was holding, Fields stood back and looked at the three of them, specifically at the way Dana stood and held herself, and the way Mia had not introduced her. And he said with the precision of a man who read a room the same way he read imaging, "I don't think we've met." "Dana Voss," she said. She did not offer a title or a context. "She's a friend," Mia said. Fields looked between them. He looked at Carter. He was a man who was very good at understanding that some information was not for him, and while it visibly cost him something to leave it there, he did. "Continuous monitoring," he said to Mia. "Imaging in the morning before rounds. And Sergeant, if I come back tomorrow and you have pulled out any of my work trying to reach something, I will personally zip tie your wrists to the bed rail." He picked up the chart. "I'm not joking." "Understood," Carter said. Fields walked out. He paused for just a fraction of a second as he passed Dana, a pause so brief it was almost not there, and then he was gone. Mia finished her documentation at the bedside. Dana had taken the chair near the window and was watching Carter with the particular expression of someone who had something to say and was waiting for the right moment to say it. Carter was watching the ceiling and breathing with the careful management of a man who had just been reminded exactly how much of his body was currently damaged. "You two know each other," he said, not to either of them specifically, just to the room. "Yes," Mia said, "from before." "Yes." He turned his head toward Dana. "And you came here to find her." Dana leaned forward slightly. "I came because there are things Mia needs to know, and I'd rather tell her here than have them find her before I do." "Who's them?" Carter said. His voice had a different quality now, something sharper, something that Mia associated with a soldier who had just understood that a situation was larger than he was originally briefed for. Dana looked at Mia. Mia looked back at her and felt the familiar weight of something that had been at the edge of her life for 3 years circling and was now finally coming to land. "Your unit," Dana said to Carter. "The op you were running when the blast happened. Do you know what the target was?" Carter was quiet for a moment. "I know my part of it." "There was a secondary objective," Dana said, "above your authorization level. It involved intelligence assets related to a network we have been tracking for 4 years since a specific operation in Kandahar in 2021. She paused. "An operation that Mia ran the medical support on. An operation where 2 members of the network were captured and 2 escaped. And the 2 that escaped have been rebuilding slowly, specifically, and deliberately targeting the people who were attached to that operation." Dana looked at Mia. "You're on a list, Mia. You have been for over a year. We didn't know they'd located you until Carter's incident report put St. Catherine's into a system that they also have access to." The room was extremely quiet. Carter turned his head toward Mia, and she could feel the precise moment when his assessment of the situation rearranged itself. She watched it happen in his face, the shift from patient to soldier, from civilian context to operational context, as naturally as a lens coming into focus. "How long have you known," Maya asked Dana, "that you were on the list 14 months, that they'd potentially located you 36 hours? And you waited 36 hours." "I got on a plane in 37, Dana said quietly. Mia breathed. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and she breathed, and she looked at the monitor beside Carter's bed with its steady bright numbers. And she thought about 3 years of a quiet life in a city she had chosen specifically because it was not connected to anything. A nursing degree she'd earned in 2.5 years instead of 4 because she had studied with the same obsessive focus she applied to everything. A floor she knew the layout of the way, she knew the layout of every space she worked in, exits and assets, not because she was paranoid, but because it was how her brain was wired and always would be. None of that was armor for this. "What do they want?" she said. "The intelligence from the Kandahar operation. Specifically the location of a source you helped extract. Your team was the last one with that source before he was moved to a classified site. The network believes you know where he went." "I don't," Mia said immediately. "I know that," Dana said, "but they don't, and they're not the kind of people who accept a denial without first applying considerable pressure to see whether the denial holds." Carter said very quietly, "How considerable?" Dana looked at him. 3 people connected to that operation have been approached in the last 8 months. 2 of them are no longer able to be approached. The monitor kept its count. Outside in the hallway, the floor went about its ordinary evening business carts and footsteps and the low-register hum of a hospital that never stopped. None of it touched the air in room 412. "I need to think," Mia said. "You have less time to think than you'd like," Dana said. Not cruelly, just accurately. Carter shifted in the bed. "She's not doing this alone." He said it the way he'd said, "I've had 2 chest tubes," like a fact he was reading from the record. Simple, complete, not up for revision. Dana looked at him. "Sergeant, with respect, you have a chest tube and a surgical follow-up in the morning." "I'm aware of my medical situation," he said. "I'm also aware that the reason I'm alive, this conversation is sitting right there. So I'd appreciate it if we factor that in when we figure out what happens next." Something went through Mia at that something, quick and complicated, that she did not examine in real time because she couldn't afford to. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was not conflicted about it. "Carter," she said. "Not negotiating," he said. She looked at Dana. "Who else knows I'm here, specifically?" "In terms of the network, we believe 2 people at most have the hospital name. They won't have your exact position within the facility yet, but that's a gap that closes quickly once someone is motivated to close it." "Fields," Mia said. Dana tilted her head. "What about him?" "He's already asking questions. He pulled my personnel file this morning. If anyone comes in asking about staff with a military background, he's going to be the first person who can give them a complete picture without understanding what he's giving." She paused. "Not because he's careless, because he's thorough. That's worse." Dana was quiet for a moment. "That's a real problem." "I know." Mia stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to both of them and looked at the glass and thought, not emotionally but architecturally, the way she had been trained to think about threat and response and the geometry of a situation. "I need to talk to him before someone else does." "Mia," Dana said carefully, "bringing a civilian into this, he's already in it. He brought himself in when he started digging." She turned around. "The question isn't whether Fields is involved. He is. The question is whether he's involved with accurate information or whether he's a vulnerability walking around with partial data and a habit of asking questions out loud." Dana looked at her for a long moment. "You've been running this floor like a post," she said, not accusatory, something closer to recognition. Mia didn't answer that. She looked at Carter. "How are you feeling, honestly?" "Like I want to get out of this bed." "That's not helpful." "It's honest." He looked at her. "Tell me what you need me to do. Right now, I need you to stay in that bed and keep your saturation above 95 and let me handle the pieces I can handle." She looked at him until he nodded, which took a moment but happened. "Dana, I need everything you have on the 2 individuals. Names, last known positions, known entry points to Chicago. Can you get me that tonight?" "I can get you most of it tonight." "Most is fine. Start with whatever they know about me." She picked up her tablet and her stethoscope from the bedside table. "I'm going to finish my shift. I'm going to talk to Fields. And tomorrow morning I'm going to be in his OR for that polytrauma case because if I disappear from my normal pattern right now, I'm making myself easier to find, not harder." Dana stood. She looked at Mia with something that mixed professional assessment and something older. Something that went back further than any operation or briefing or personnel file. "You know this is going to come apart," she said. "The life you built here, It's already coming apart. Everything comes apart eventually, Mia said. The question is whether you manage it or whether it manages you. She moved toward the door. Carter's voice stopped her the same way it had the night before. Just her name. Mia. 2 syllables that he said with a weight that other people didn't put in them. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself one breath, then she turned. He was looking at her from the bed with the monitor green and steady behind him, and his jaw set and his eyes clear in a way that she found harder to handle than most of the things that had happened in the last 48 hours. Whatever you were before you came here, he said, whatever you've been carrying, all of it, the reason you left, and the reason you've been here being invisible for 3 years. He paused. None of it makes you less. You know that, right? She stood in the doorway of room 412, and she felt the thing in her chest that had no good name, and she held his gaze for a moment that was longer than professional, and she said, "Get some sleep, Sergeant." She walked back to the nurse's station, and she sat down and she pulled Fields' name up on the internal directory, and she stared at it for 30 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was still in the building, which she had calculated was likely. "Fields," he said. "It's Rodriguez," she said. "I need 15 minutes. Not about the case tomorrow, about something that affects the safety of this floor." A pause, shorter than she expected. "My office, 20 minutes. Thank you." She hung up. Across the hall, behind a closed door she could not see through, Donna Voss was on her own phone, speaking in the low, precise tones of someone managing a situation that was already in motion. Carter was lying in a hospital bed with a chest tube and a healing thorax, and a look in his eyes that Mia had not been able to leave behind in the room no matter how many times she had walked away from it. And somewhere in the city, outside, in the ordinary anonymous dark of Chicago on a Wednesday night, something was moving toward her that had been moving for a long time and had finally found its direction. She took her badge off the lanyard and looked at it. Mia Rodriguez, RN. The photo was 3 years old. The woman in it was looking at the camera with the careful blankness of someone who had decided to become someone else, someone smaller, someone that nothing important would ever need to find. She put the badge back on. She had 20 minutes. She intended to use them. Part 4, Louis viết du bang into liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần tiếp đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lỗi AI kể theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ, kịch tính không viết lần màn kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mực document mời, 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger, mạnh hơn tăng tính tự nhiên, cho phản ứng của các nhân vật thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả thêm đánh dấu thời gian. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, không có phần gạch trong bài viết, viết văn bản phù hợp với thịt và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nha, không chia móc thời gian. Show more 10-50 sao. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing and emotional depth. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing and emotional depth. Fields' office was small for a man of his position, which Mia had always taken as a sign that he spent as little time in it as possible. He was at his desk when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the kind of detail that told her he'd been working rather than just waiting. He gestured to the chair across from him without preamble, and she sat in it, and she did not waste either of their time with small talk. 3 years ago, she said, I came to this hospital because it was large enough to disappear into and far enough from the places I'd been that I thought the distance would be protection. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest, because the rest is going to make you ask why I didn't say something sooner, and that's the answer. I was trying to stay gone. Fields leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to listen in operating rooms where unnecessary sound was a liability. He did not say anything. He waited. She told him, Not everything, not the operational details that were not hers to give, but enough. The Kandahar operation, the network, the list, the two people who had been approached in the last 8 months and were no longer available to be approached. She watched his face as she laid it out, and she watched the particular quality of his attention shift from the professional mode he used for clinical information into something more personal and more alarmed, and she let it shift because that alarm was appropriate, and she needed him to be working with accurate information rather than the partial picture he'd been constructing on his own. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The woman," he said, "in Carter's room earlier, Dana Voss, my former commanding officer. She's here as what protection? She's here as warning," Mia said. "The protection part is more complicated." He pressed his palms flat on the desk. "You said they might approach hospital staff for information about you, specifically staff with knowledge of your background. You pulled my personnel file yesterday morning," she said. "I have to assume you were not discreet about the fact that you were curious." He was quiet. She watched him reconstruct the last 24 hours from a different angle, the conversation with the ER nurses, the questions he'd asked, the way professional curiosity had moved through the hospital in the natural current of gossip and hallway talk, and she watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had. "I mentioned it to Hargrove," he said. "Jim Hargrove, Chief of Staff. We had lunch today and I brought up the anomaly in your file as a personnel curiosity." He said it like a man confessing something he understood too late was a mistake. "Hargrove knows everyone. He talks to everyone." Who was at that lunch? "The three of us, me, Hargrove, and a man I didn't recognize." Hargrove introduced him as someone from a hospital systems consulting group. He was asking about staffing and trauma department capacity. He stopped. He asked specifically about whether we'd had any unusually skilled admissions recently. I thought it was a staffing metric question. The temperature in the room changed. Mia felt it the way she felt all the important shifts, not as emotion first, but as information, a rearrangement of variables that produced a new and less favorable calculation. "What did you say?" she said. "I said we'd had a notable trauma case last night and that the response had been exceptional." His jaw was tight. "I said one of our nurses had demonstrated clinical instincts well above her stated experience level." The silence between them was the kind that had weight. "Did he ask for a name?" "Hargrove offered it," Fields said, and the words came out flat and hard, the way you said something that you wanted to be able to take back. "He said your name. He knew it because I'd already mentioned it to him earlier in the week." Mia stood up. She was not panicking. She was moving, which was different and more useful. "I need to call Dana." "Mia." He stood too. She registered that he had used her first name, which he had never done before, and she registered what that meant in terms of how rapidly the situation had reorganized his understanding of who she was to him. "If this man at the lunch was who you think he was, he may have been a contact, or he may have been nothing," she said. "I don't know yet, but I need to operate as though he was something until I know otherwise." She was already at the door. "Do not call Hargrove tonight. Do not mention this conversation to anyone. If anyone asks you anything about me before I have a chance to talk to you tomorrow, you tell them I'm a floor nurse who had a good night in the trauma bay and you know nothing else. Can you do that?" He looked at her with an expression that was part surgeons of control and part something raw, the look of a man who has just understood that the world he operates in is larger and less safe than he had arranged it to be. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She went out. She was calling Dana before she reached the elevator, and Donna picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for the call. Mia gave her the information about the lunch in 12 seconds flat, stripped of everything that wasn't operationally relevant, and Dana was quiet for exactly 3 seconds before she said, "Get back to the floor. Stay visible. I'm making a call." Mia got back to the floor. She stayed visible. She did her 9 o'clock medication rounds with a composed efficiency that the other nurses on her shift had long since stopped noticing, because it was simply how Mia was reliable, precise, present, and she moved through the familiar geography of the 4th floor and let the routine of it do what routine was designed to do, which was give the hands something to hold on to while the mind worked. She checked on Carter at 9:20. He was awake, which surprised her less than it would have 2 days ago. He had the look of a man who had been lying in a hospital bed reassessing everything and had reached the far end of his patience with his own stillness. "Fields," he said when she came in. "I talked to him. How'd he take it?" "Better than I expected. He made a mistake. He didn't know it was a mistake, and he's sitting with it." She checked his drain. "He's useful if he's steady. I think he'll be steady." "He's the kind of man who needs to feel like he's doing something," Carter said. "Give him a bone and he'll be fine. Leave him standing on the sideline and he'll start improvising, and that's where it gets complicated." She looked at him. "That's a pretty quick read." "I've been watching him since I got here. You learn a lot about people when you're horizontal and they think you're focused on your own pain." He paused. "Also, he's not that hard to read once you know the type." She adjusted his pillow angle, and he let her, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that had become its own language in the last 2 days, silence that didn't need to be filled because it was already full of everything that had passed between them. "Donna came back," he said. "She's in the building somewhere. She has a contact she's running down." "The man at the lunch?" "Possibly." She straightened up. "How's the pain manageable?" "That's not a scale of 1 to 10. 4, he said. 4.5 when I breathe deep. I've been doing the breathing exercises your PT girl left me." He said it with a slight emphasis on the doing that meant he wanted credit for the compliance, which she found unexpectedly briefly endearing. "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Mia, if they've already identified you here, then staying visible only works for so long. At some point, visible just means easier to find." "I know." "Do you have a plan past tomorrow morning?" "I have the beginning of a plan. Donna has the other parts." "What's the beginning?" She looked at him. She thought about how much to say, and she thought about Danny Reyes and a business plan that would never open. And she thought about the particular look on Carter's face when he'd said none of it makes you less. And she decided that the man who had kept her confidence twice in 2 days without being asked deserved more than a deflection. "The beginning is that I stopped running from it," she said. 3 years ago, I walked away from everything because I thought if I made myself small enough, ordinary enough, disconnected enough, nothing would follow me. And most things didn't. But the things that do follow you, they don't care how small you have made yourself. They find the smallness and they use it." She paused. "So the beginning is I stopped making myself small." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face, and it was not pity, which she would have resented, and it was not admiration exactly, which she would have been uncomfortable with, and it was not whatever thing she had been carefully not naming every time she walked away from his room and took the stairs so she could breathe. It was something cleaner and more complicated than any of those things. "Good, he said quietly. "It's a good beginning." She picked up his chart. "Get some sleep." "You keep telling me that. You keep not doing it." She walked out. In the hallway, she passed one of the night nurses, a young man named Terrence, who had been at St. Catherine's for 8 months and who was in Mia's private assessment going to be excellent in about 2 years, when he stopped second-guessing himself. He gave her the nod that was the currency of the night shift, the acknowledgement that they were both still standing and the floor was still intact, and she gave it back and kept moving. Dana was at the nurse's station at 10:15, which meant she had found what she needed or had found something she hadn't expected, which was always worse. She was holding a paper coffee cup that she clearly was not drinking, and her expression had the careful, neutral quality that Mia associated with situations that had developed new and unpleasant dimensions. Mia sat down across from her and waited. "The man at the lunch," Dana said, keeping her voice at the register that didn't carry past the two of them. "I ran the description Fields gave me against some flagged entries. I think it was a contact, not a principal, meaning he's a local asset doing a locating while not one of the two we're actually concerned about." She paused. "Which is a smaller problem, but not a small problem. It means they're already in the city and already running reconnaissance. They sent someone to confirm your location before they move. How much time does that typically give us? In my experience with how this network operates, 48 to 72 hours between confirmation and approach, maybe less if they feel urgent." Dana finally looked down at her coffee. "There's something else." Mia waited. "The personnel file Fields pulled, HR has a record of who requested it and when. That record lives in an administrative system that as of about 2 hours ago, someone accessed remotely who was not supposed to have access to that system. Dana looked at her. They know you're here. They know your full name and your employment record, and they know which floor you work on. The 4th floor, the floor she had moved through tonight in the comfortable dark of established routine. The floor she knew the exits of, not because she was paranoid, but because she was wired that way and always would be. Carter, she said. Carter's name is on the floor's patient manifest. Dana confirmed. Which means if they pull his location the same way they pulled yours, they know exactly which room he's in. Mia was on her feet and moving before Dana finished the sentence. She heard Dana behind her saying, "That's not the most urgent part, Mia," but she was already at room 412, and she pushed the door open, and Carter was awake, still awake, and he looked at her face and she watched him read it in the single second before she said anything. "We need to move you," she said. He didn't ask why. He asked how far, different room, different floor, if I can arrange it. Right now, different room. She was already at the monitor, already running through what could be temporarily disconnected and what couldn't, already calculating the logistics of moving a man with a chest tube who had been ambulatory for less than 24 hours. "Can you stand?" "Yes." "With help?" "With less help than you think." "Okay." She grabbed the drain bag and hooked it to the IV pole, and she helped him sit up, and his face did the thing where the pain showed for exactly 1 second and then was managed back down, and she put her arm under his and felt the solid weight of him, the surprising warmth of it, and she thought about none of that and focused on the immediate problem of getting him vertical. He made it to his feet. He was unsteady for 2 seconds, and then he was not. Which was the stubbornness she had come to recognize as structural, not performance. It was just how he was built. "Down the hall," she said. "Room 408 should be empty. It was a discharge this afternoon." "Lead the way," he said. She moved him out of the room and down the hall, and she was aware of Donna behind them, and she was aware of Terrence at the far end of the floor looking up from his charting with the expression of someone who understood that something significant was happening and was choosing to trust Mia's judgment rather than ask questions, which was another reason she thought he was going to be excellent. She got Carter into room 408 and into the bed, and she rehung the drain bag and checked every connection twice, and he lay there watching her work with the particular focused patience of a man who understood necessity. "Someone's coming," he said. "Possibly tonight, possibly tomorrow." She checked the seal on the tube. "I'm not leaving this floor tonight." "Mia, you can't." "I'm not leaving this floor," she repeated, and there was no argument in it, just fact laid down flat and unmovable. He looked at her. "You've done this before," he said, held a position. "More times than I counted." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what do you need from me?" "To stay in this bed, to not rip out any of my work, and to tell me immediately if anyone comes in this room who isn't me, Dana, or Dr. Fields." "Done." He held her gaze. "And Mia," she paused. "You're not just a nurse," he said. Not as a revelation, not as a compliment, as a statement of something so plainly true that it had been obvious since the first morning she'd walked into his room, and perhaps before that in a trauma bay where nobody had wanted her and she had stayed anyway. "You haven't been just anything your entire life. I think you know that." She stood at the bedside with the IV pole between them and the monitor counting his pulse in steady green increments in the night pressing against the window behind him. And she felt the precise geography of everything she had been carrying for 3 years, the weight of it, the shape of it, the particular exhaustion of holding something that heavy in a posture designed to look effortless. "Try to sleep," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. She went back to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, and she turned around one more time, because there was something else, something she had been not saying for 2 days, and the fact that someone was potentially coming for her in the next 48 hours had a way of clarifying which things were worth the not saying and which things weren't. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you're alive." He looked at her from the pillow, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and entirely sincere. "Yeah," he said, "me too." She went back to the station. Dana was on the phone speaking in the clipped, efficient shorthand of someone escalating a situation to people with more resources, and Mia sat down at the computer, and she pulled up the fourth floor layout on the internal system, and she began to work. Access points, elevator positions, staff schedules for the next 18 hours, the location of every security camera on the floor, the schedule of the hospital's contracted security team. She had held positions before. She had done it with less and in worse circumstances and without a clean floor, in working electricity and a colleague like Dana managing the upstream intelligence. She had also done it with a unit, with people on either side of her who knew what they were doing and why they were doing it, and who were staying because they'd made the same choice she had, which was that some things were worth defending, past the point where defending them was comfortable. She thought about Fields sitting in his office with the weight of an accidental mistake and the uncommon willingness to sit with it. She thought about Terrence at the end of the hall, who was going to be excellent and who was currently, without being asked, staying at his station instead of going to the break room, even though his scheduled break had been 40 minutes ago. She thought about Dana on the phone doing the unglamorous and relentless work of trying to keep a situation manageable before it became unmanageable. She thought about Carter in room 408 in a bed she had put him in because she was not going to lose a man she had already kept alive once. She opened a new document on the computer. She began to type. She had 18 hours approximately, and she intended to use every one of them. Part 5, Louis viết từ 3.000 đến 3.200 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống doanh giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lời ai, kể theo ngôi thứ 3 giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Liều kết trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang một document mới 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả kênh Việt văn bản phù hợp với TTS và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệ nhé. Không chia mọc thời gian, show more 15, không một orchestrated final narrative arc với mini climax twist và kết thúc mạnh orchestrated final narrative arc với mini climax twist và kết thúc mạnh she worked through the night. Not the frantic reactive work of someone managing a crisis as it arrived, but the deliberate architectural work of someone who had decided to stop being a target and start being a position. She mapped access points. She cross-referenced the hospital's security rotation with the floor schedule. She identified every staff member who would be on the fourth floor between 6 in the morning and noon, which was the window Dana had narrowed the probable approach to after 2 more calls with her contacts overnight. She did all of this at the nurse's station in plain sight between medication checks and vital sign rounds, because visible was still safer than hidden, and because the floor was her ground and she was not going to yield it. Donna came back at midnight with a name. She set a folded piece of paper on the counter between them, and Mia unfolded it and read the name written there and felt the specific cold clarity that came when a threat became concrete and specific rather than ambient and theoretical. A name meant a person. A person meant a set of behaviors, a history, a way of moving through spaces, something she could work with. He was at the lunch, Dana said quietly. Confirmed. Hargrove is not a knowing participant. He was just used, which is a conversation Hargrove is going to need to have with someone, but not tonight. She paused. The second principal, the one we're more concerned about, is believed to be in Chicago, but hasn't been physically located yet. My contact has 2 people running that down. If the first one is a locating asset, the second one is the actual approach, Mia said. Yes. Then the first one finishing his job is the trigger, which means if we move on the first one before he finishes reporting back, we create a gap. It buys time. Mia folded the paper and held it. How do you want to handle it? There are federal people who have been tracking this network for 2 years, Dana said. They've been waiting for a domestic contact point to surface. This man surfaces, we hand them his location and his purpose, they move. She looked at Mia. It's not dramatic, it's paperwork and a phone call and two agents in a parking lot, but it closes the immediate threat. And the second principle is a longer problem. Donna held her gaze, one that is better handled by people with the resources to handle it, not by a floor nurse and a retired colonel running improvised protective custody in a hospital room. Mia was quiet for a moment. You think I should come back in? I think the Army Medical Command has been holding a position for you for 14 months, and I think you have spent 3 years being smaller than you are, and I think the people who need you are not limited to the 4th floor of St. Catherine's Hospital. Dana said it without pressure, just laid it flat the way honest things deserve to be laid. But that's a decision for tomorrow. Tonight we close the immediate problem. Mia looked at the folded paper. She thought about the documents she'd been building on the computer, the floor layout, the schedules, the careful architecture of a defense. She thought about this woman in the badge photo, 3 years old, carefully blank, trying to become someone that nothing important would need. She thought about Carter in room 408, saying you haven't been just anything your entire life. She picked up the phone and she handed it to Dana. Make your call, she said. Dana made it. It took 11 minutes, and it was the most undramatic 11 minutes Mia had experienced in 2 days. And when it was done, Dana set the phone down and said, they move at 2 a.m. We sit on this floor until I get confirmation. They sat. Mia did her 2 o'clock rounds. She checked on Carter and found him finally legitimately asleep, breathing with the slow, managed depth of someone whose body had finally overridden his stubbornness. And she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the monitor count his pulse, and she let herself feel the full weight of the relief before she put it somewhere manageable and moved on. The confirmation came at 2:47. One text to Dana's phone, 3 words. She showed it to Mia across the counter. Asset is secured. Mia breathed out slowly. It was not over. The second principal was still unlocated, and the larger situation had not resolved itself. But the immediate window had closed, and she was still standing on her floor in her hospital, and nobody who needed her tonight had been taken from her. Go home, Dana said. I'm on shift until 7. Mia, I'm on shift until 7, she said again, and the repetition was not stubbornness. It was the particular kind of intention that comes after you've decided something fundamental about how you're going to live. I'm not leaving early. This is still my floor. Dana looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the real one, the one that went back further than any briefing, and she said, I'll be in the lobby. Come find me when you're done. The last 4 hours of the shift passed the way the hours after a crisis always passed, which was slowly and with a strange lightness, the lightness of a thing that was supposed to happen and didn't. Mia moved through the floor, and she knew every person on it, and she did her work, and she was for the first time in 3 years not trying to be invisible while she did it. Terrence caught her at 6:30, 40 minutes before shift change, and he looked at her with the careful deliberateness of someone who had processed the night's events and arrived at a specific question. Are you okay? He said. She looked at him. She thought about all the ways she had answered that question over the last 3 years, deflections and clinical redirects, and the standard fine that meant nothing. I will be, she said. He nodded, accepting that. For what it's worth, he said. I don't know what happened last night, but I know you were managing something real, and you were steady the whole time, and I want to be like that someday. That's steady. She looked at this young man who was going to be excellent and who had no idea yet how much that was going to cost him and mean to him at the same time. And she said, you already are, Terrence. You just haven't had enough nights like this one to see it yet. He stood a little straighter, not performing it, just responding to something that had landed in a real place. And she went back to her charting, and she finished her notes, and she logged out at 7:02. Carter was awake when she stopped by room 408 on her way out. He had managed through what she suspected was considerable creative maneuvering to position himself sitting up at the maximum allowable angle, and he had a small notebook open on the tray table, the physical kind with a pen, and he was writing something in it that he closed when she came in with the reflexive privacy of a man who'd been caught at something personal. Did you sleep? She said. Some. How's the pain? 3, he said. Maybe 2.5. He looked at her. He looked at her face the way he had been looking at her face since the first morning, reading the information there with the same precision he read everything. It held, he said. Not a question. It held. He exhaled. It was the first fully unguarded breath she had seen him take, and it changed his face for a moment, softened it, showed something underneath the bearing, and the control that was simply human and real. "And you," he said, "I'm standing." "That's not what I asked." She came and stood at the foot of his bed, which had become in 2 days the geography of their particular kind of conversation, her standing and him sitting up, and the space between them charged with everything that was being said and everything that wasn't. "I'm going to talk to Dana this morning about coming back in, about the medical command position." She paused. "I think it's time." He was quiet. She watched the meaning of that move through him, not slowly but in layers, what it meant for the situation that had brought them together, what it meant for her, what it might mean for whatever this was between them that they had both been carefully not naming. "That's the right call," he said, and it cost him something to say it simply and without qualification, and she respected the effort. "I know." He picked up the pen he'd set down when she came in, turned it in his fingers. "When Fields did your surgery follow-up this morning, did he say anything about discharge timeline for me?" "You're at least 4 more days. 5 if you keep getting out of bed." "I won't get out of bed." "You got out of bed yesterday morning and did push-ups." "I said I won't do it again." He met her eyes. "I'm a man of my word, Mia." She looked at him, and something moved through her that was warm and specific and entirely inconvenient, and she did not look away from it the way she had been looking away from it for 2 days. She just let it be there, real and acknowledged in hers. "4 days," she said, "maybe 5. And when you are discharged and you are back in Michigan or wherever they send you for your recovery." She stopped. "Go on," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'm going to look like in 4 days," she said. "What my life is going to look like. I'm making decisions that are going to change things, and I don't know the exact shape of the change yet. I need you to know that before anything else gets said." "I know that," he said, "and it doesn't." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He set the pen down. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated honesty that she had come to understand was simply his nature, the way precision was her nature, something structural and reliable. "I've known you for 3 days, and you've saved my life once and sat with me while I grieved one of my guys and moved me to a different room at midnight to keep me safe and stayed on your floor all night because it was your floor and you weren't going to leave it." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry. I just want to know that I'll see you again." She held his gaze, and she thought about Danny Reyes' restaurant that was never going to open, and about a corporal named Dennis who had survived, and about a woman in a 3-year-old badge photo who had been trying to become nobody. "You'll see me again," she said. He nodded once, and the thing in his face was not a smile, and was not relief, and was not triumph. It was just the quiet of someone who had been given a true thing and was holding it carefully. She picked up her bag. She was at the door when he spoke one more time, and his voice had something in it she had not heard from him before, something lower and more private, something that had been waiting through all the clinical exchanges and the nighttime gravity and the careful navigation of everything they had not said. "Mia," he said, "I wish," he stopped, then steadily, "I wish you were mine too." She stood in the doorway of room 408 with the morning light beginning to come through the window at the end of the hall, and she felt those words move through her the way the most important things always move through her, not fast, not with fanfare, but deep, settling into a place that had been empty for a long time and fitting there with a precision that nothing forced ever achieved. She turned around. He was looking at her without apology or performance, just the plain, unguarded face of a man who had said the true thing and was waiting to see what the true thing did. She crossed back to the bed. She put her hand over his where it rested on the tray table, and she held it for a moment that was not long by any external measure and was complete in every internal one. 4 days, she said. He turned his hand under hers and held it back. 4 days, he agreed. She left. She walked down the 4th-floor corridor for the last time as a floor nurse who was only a floor nurse, and she knew it, and she let it be what it was, both an ending and the kind of ending that was the first necessary condition of a beginning. Fields was at the nurse's station. She had not expected him to be there at 7 in the morning, but she was no longer surprised by him either. He was looking at something on the computer, and he looked up when she came, and he stood, which was not something he had ever done when she approached the station, and she registered what that meant. "I want to formally recommend you for the trauma department position," he said. No preamble. Full clinical role. commensurate with your actual experience level, which I should have been asking about 3 years ago. He paused. I know you may be making other decisions. I'm putting the recommendation in regardless, because it's the right thing and I'm late doing it. She looked at him. She thought about the first day she'd walked onto this floor and he'd looked through her like furniture, and she thought about a man who could be wrong and know it and say so, which was rarer than surgical skill and in some ways more valuable. Thank you, Jonathan, she said, using his name for the first time. He received it with the slight adjustment of a man accepting something he wasn't used to accepting. I'll be submitting it this morning. She nodded. She went to find Dana. Dana was in the lobby the way she'd said she would be, and when Mia came off the elevator, Dana looked at her face and read whatever was there without asking her to articulate it. Ready, Dana said. Tell me about the position, Mia said, and Dana told her. As they walked out of St. Catherine's Hospital into a Chicago morning that was cold and clear and full of the ordinary sounds of a city moving through its Thursday, Dana told her about the medical command role, the scope of it, the team, the work that needed doing, that very few people had the specific combination of skills and experience to do. She told her about the ways it would be different from what she'd been doing and the ways it would be the same, which were the ways that had always mattered most to her, the work of keeping people alive, the work of being the person in the room who saw what others hadn't seen yet. Mia listened. She walked and she listened, and above her, the sky was the particular blue of early spring in Chicago temporary, and brilliant, the kind of day that reminded you that the cold does not last forever, that things open back up again if you let them. She thought about 8 years of service and 3 years of hiding, and the 2 days in between that had dismantled everything she'd built to keep herself contained. She thought about a trauma bay at 11:53 on a Tuesday night, and a man bleeding on a table, and a room full of people who hadn't seen what she saw, and the decision to step forward anyway. She thought about the particular feeling of her hands being steady when everything else was not. She stopped walking. Dana stopped beside her. I'll need 30 days, Mia said, to close out my responsibilities here. Properly, not just to notice. I'm not leaving this floor without training whoever comes after me. 30 days is fine, Dana said, and I have conditions. I expected that. I'm not a desk function. I'm clinical, or I'm not there. Clinical, Dana confirmed, and I want visibility on the second principle. I want to know when he's located and how it's resolved, not a summary after the fact, actual visibility. Dana looked at her. That's a bigger ask. I know. A pause. I'll see what I can do. That means yes, Mia said. It means I'll see what I can do, Dana said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that meant the same thing. Mia looked at the hospital behind her, at the building she had spent 3 years inside at the floor. She couldn't see from here, but knew the layout of better than any space she'd lived in. She thought about Terrence becoming excellent and Fields submitting a recommendation that was 4 years late and still worth something. She thought about a man in room 408 who had a notebook on his tray table in 4 more days. She thought about the things she'd said to Carter, which was also the things she was saying now to herself, to the life she'd constructed out of careful smallness and deliberate distance, to the woman in the badge photo who had been trying to be no one for 3 years. Stop making yourself small. She turned back to Dana. I'll have an answer for you in writing by end of week. I'll be waiting, Dana said. Mia walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off, and she did not do the thing she usually did, which was use the drive to rebuild whatever had come apart during the shift. She just sat with it, the full complicated weight of everything that had changed in 48 hours, and she let it be the size it actually was instead of the size she needed it to be to manage it. It was large. It was real. It was underneath all the fear and the exhaustion and the grief for a young man from El Paso who had wanted to open a restaurant, the first honest thing she had felt in 3 years that she hadn't immediately worked to contain. She started the car on the 4th floor of St. Catherine's Hospital in room 408. Sergeant Michael Carter opened his notebook back to the page he'd been writing on when she came in, and he finished the sentence he'd stopped in the middle of, and he set the pen down and looked at it, and he did not try to talk himself out of any of it. And in the lobby, Dana Voss was already on the phone, not with the contacts managing the network, but with the medical command office at Fort Sam Houston, telling them to hold the position for 1 more month because Captain Rodriguez was coming back. Not because she had to, not because she'd been found, but because she had finally, after 3 years of being almost invisible, decided that the world still needed what she had, and she was done pretending otherwise. Mia Rodriguez had spent 3 years making herself into a floor nurse because she thought smallness was safety. She had been wrong, and now she knew it, and the knowing was not a wound. It was the first solid ground she had stood on since the day she'd walked out of uniform and into a life that was never going to be big enough to hold her. She had saved a soldier, held a floor, faced what was coming for her without flinching, and walked back into her own life with her hands steady and her eyes open. She had always been more than just a nurse. It had just taken the right Tuesday night, the right bleeding soldier, and the right pair of brown eyes finally seeing her clearly to make her willing to stop pretending that was something to hide.